which is a range of things from parks and reserves to regional parks to land under community centres and what have you. If you look at the land that immediately surrounds a lot of these assets, probably the market value and alternative use may be as high as 50 billion, certainly significantly higher than they're currently being assessed. So, but the financing opportunity here exists in regard to these assets where there's situations where there's a materially higher alternative use value for the land. And so that creates potentially two situations. One where, in those situations, could council look to provide the underlying service in a way that still manages to free up those land and buildings? Or is the level of market value that's attached to that particular asset so high that you can't really justify providing the underlying service to such a small number of residents compared to the benefit that might be obtained for the whole of Auckland if you could free up some of that money? Now, so we're not sitting here advocating a wholesale sale of parks and community facilities. What we are suggesting, however, is that we suspect the attitude to providing, for example, golf courses in the inner city is different if you think that land is worth $61 million as it's currently on the balance sheet, as opposed to if you think it's worth $1.5 billion. We think that if you've got an underutilised community asset, that you might have a different view about whether you could try and have that service provided in a different way if the land and buildings underneath it is worth $1 million as opposed to if it's worth $10 million. So the major recommendation we're making here really is, and it echoes EY's, which is what we really need is a central register of the land and buildings that are being used that sit underneath the community services, that details what their alternative value use is and the constraints that might exist in terms of releasing that, so that the council can make informed decisions about whether these are the right uses of this capital. And finally, the commercial assets. In our view, the framework that needs to be applied here is we start from the premise that we think the arguments are pretty weak for the council to own assets purely for the benefit of getting a commercial return. The council is capital constrained. We assume it has projects that it can't do for want of money that it would like to do and it believes are value enhancing. So therefore, to have capital tied up in assets that are only expected to earn from this point on a commercial return seems like an odd choice to make in that capital constrained environment. So to us, the key issue about whether the council should own commercial assets is one that's based on what is the rationale for ownership and control of that particular asset. And we think that there needs to be a relatively compelling control imperative to support Auckland Council ownership, and that would include that the service wouldn't be provided without council ownership, or, and this is probably the nub of it really, that there's some conflict between the business plan you're going to see under private ownership and the business plan that the public sector would prefer. And so, the major recommendation in this section is that what we think you need is a pretty robust process where you go through and you tease out just why it is that you think that the council needs to own certain assets, what public good it is protecting through its ownership, and whether or not there are alternatives that could still allow that protection, if it is required, to be delivered, other than the existing level of ownership of that asset. Because we, in a report you've seen, is that we have looked through a large number of these assets, and by and large, there are exceptions, but by and large, we think prima facie at the moment some of the rationale for commercial ownership is relatively weak. That's not to say that the assets aren't strategically important, and it's not to say that they haven't provided a strong return in the past, but it's just to say that the underlying imperative for council control, it doesn't appear to be that strong. So we certainly recommend a more robust process around that. Final slide. Just some more sort of general related observations and recommendations. Again, we start from the point that we regard Auckland Council as capital constrained, so therefore processes that encourage capital efficiency are important. And so, here are some sort of observations and recommendations that we dropped out of our work. First of all, we think that there needs to be a greater sort of use of opportunity cost analysis in the decision around asset ownership. The reality is that a decision to retain ownership of an asset or a business or an activity, you've got to consider the alternative use of the capital involved in that. In a capital constrained world, a decision to carry on owning asset X is actually a decision to own asset X in preference to doing project Y. So that goes to the very heart of our point that simply earning a commercial return is not a sufficient test of the benefit of council ownership, because you're foregoing investing in something that you think will be better. We think there needs to be more, as we said earlier, more rigorous testing of the council ownership and control imperative across its assets. We think that there's the use of the council's borrowing rate as a test of the sense of ownership is incorrect. We understand why it happens, because at the margin the borrowing rate decides the funding implication, but the reality is that that favours the retention of high yielding assets without any recognition of their risk. And the reality is that your balance sheet is not 100% funded by debt. Of your 42 odd billion of assets, about 8 billion is funded by debt. The rest is funded by scarce ratepayer equity, who should want to see that money invested in stuff that's going to give them the best return as people of Auckland. The next comment we'd make is that once Auckland acquires assets and they're used for a purpose, the use of that capital seems to be regarded as free, and that goes to the point that we're making about community assets, that constantly being aware what the alternative use value of the land that's being used to provide a community service is important. And you should always be testing whether or not you can provide the service or meet your obligation to that service in a way that uses less capital. And we don't really see that in the processes that exist around the budgetary elements at the moment. And then the final point is that there's quite strong disincentives at the local board level to not identify assets that may be better, where the value might be better used elsewhere, and that reflects the fact that any land sale that happens at a local level, the funding just disappears into the consolidated fund. So working out some arrangements with local boards where, if they provide a service in a way that frees up capital value, that they actually receive some of the benefit back to the board level, I think would be appropriate as well. So those are our major recommendations.
Great, very good, thank you very much. Now, I have first up Cathy, Councillor Case.
Oh, it's the same question I asked you at the workshop, just with a bit more added on now since I've had time to read your report. You decided that housing for older people should be put through, or you're recommending to us that we put it through the commercial considerations, so there's that stream and not the community facility stream. How do you recycle an asset like housing for older people once you've sold it?
How do you recycle? The reason that it's in that group is because we believe the question that needs to be asked there is, if you have an obligation to provide housing for older people, you can test whether there's different models of providing that other than having to own the underlying housing stock that's used to provide it. And so that's the only reason it's there.
On your page, our page 97, your page 97, our page 99, you've got a summary of all the net sales, although you're telling us we shouldn't sell. There's a giant carrot on this page that says, if all the identified assets were divested, council could raise up to 2.7 billion.
Yeah. So there's
That includes housing for older people.
Yeah, so there's two things well, the thing that goes on with housing, you can sell that housing stock, right? But that you would then have an obligation to provide a subsidy to the person who is using that housing stock, to provide it to at the subsidised rate to the older people.
Oh, I didn't read that anywhere in there.
Well, it's there. So we're not suggesting that you don't provide the service. We're saying that there's a different model of providing housing for older people than the council having to own the asset. For example, the Crown at the moment is moving very much to a model where it contracts with a range of community housing providers to provide housing for social needs.
That works. If housing for older people is in the community section, it works. Then you're looking at freeing up some of the funding by delivering the service in different ways. It doesn't work when you put it in the commercial section. It doesn't work.
As I say, the only reason it's in the commercial section is because along with all the other assets, it's asking the question, does the council need to own this asset to have that service provided?
Yep, then it's land and buildings. Right, any other questions?
No.
Councillor Quacks?
Yeah, right at the outset, you made a comment about using the argument that borrowing rates are higher that the rents are higher than the borrowing rates. Is a misleading argument. Can you just expand a little further on that?
It's just simply at the moment, say the decision to own an asset is being weighed against how much debt could be reduced if you were to sell it, right? Versus the dividend stream that you're currently getting from it, right? And if the dividend stream is higher than the interest that would be saved if you sold it, then there's a prima facie decision to retain the asset. And that's driven by the fact that if you start with a premise that you've already got a balanced 10-year budget, right, that you create a funding hole by that difference if you were to sell the asset, right? But the reality is that the required return on that asset is much higher than your funding rate. And so you have to acknowledge it as a funding gap, but the underlying premise of owning an asset is that you should expect a commercial return on that asset. In the case of an office building, you can separate, if you like, in your mind, the council as tenant from the council as commercial property owner. And the commercial property owner should be getting a commercial return on that asset.
Okay, Councillor Wood?
Yeah, just in relation to this issue of debt, this cushioning of $1 billion between, so below the 250 threshold for maximum debt, that's just to be prudent, is it? You're recommending?
Yeah, look, that's just a simple calculation based on the forecast and based on expectations around what the revenue received in those years will be, and therefore how much debt capacity the council has.
And is that in an agreement we have with the local government funding agency?
The LGFA sets the criteria, so we've just done a calculation to work out that there's effectively in FY19 there's $10.5 billion of debt capacity, whereas Auckland Council expects to have $9.5 billion of debt drawn down. I guess it's a judgment about how much headroom is a prudent level of headroom to hold. What we would comment is that there's other sources of financial flexibility other than debt. Obviously, there's a diversified financial assets portfolio which could be sold at relatively short notice to meet short-term financing requirements as well.
Okay, thank you. Just another question I have is in relation to PPPs, private-public partnerships. I don't know if these people answer, but I'm just curious to know, when we enter into those partnerships that they're talking about here today, and the partner has an asset which we have to prop up if they don't get the required income, does that come onto our balance sheet as a liability and are therefore included in our debt considerations?
Yep.
It is?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. So Sky Path would be in that category.
Are we not? we're
No,
not
I'm just
talking
trying to flash this out in my mind. It's, you know, asking questions, I just wanted to know what the answers are to these
Sorry, yeah,
particular issues.
I don't know the details of the.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay. Well, no, we haven't got that sorted out yet. There's a few,
I wouldn't.
bit of water to go under the bridge before that's sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Already.
Councillor Brewer.
Thank you. I've got to bet with Councillor Wood that he says Sky Path at least once at every meeting and social occasion, and he's honouring that. Just on commercial buildings, I've had a interest in what I've described in the past as kind of the Roman relics of fallen empires that are around, and that you've attributed 280 million to those commercial / civic buildings. Are you saying, do you have a view on whether we sell them and relocate somewhere else, or we sell them and potentially stay there as lessees? And secondly, as EY suggested in their recommendations, is to broaden our accommodation strategy. Yes, we've got one across Auckland Council parent, but there seems to be a lot of conflict and lack of satisfaction that it doesn't extend across the group, including the CCOs and the IMSB. So do you also see an opportunity there in rationalisation of these commercial office buildings and